Hello and welcome everyone to the first thematic session of the week. This session is titled Managing Climate-Related Risks to Wash and Water Resources Management, and it is co-convened by the Asian Development Bank and UNICEF. We're so pleased that you're all joining us today, and in particular, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all colleagues that are joining from the two viewing hubs in Vanuatu and PNG. My name is Brooke Yamakoshi, and I am a water, sanitation, and hygiene specialist at UNICEF's East Asia and Pacific Regional Office based in Bangkok, and I'll be facilitating the session today. In this session, we'll be focusing on frameworks as tools that help us manage climate-related risks, both for water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH, and for water resources management and development. We'll be focusing on frameworks because they're central to how we make decisions. They structure our thinking and help to facilitate our understanding of both development needs as well as climate and other risks in a systematic way. During the session, we'll hear examples from both WASH and water resources sectors, but generally we'll be hearing that these frameworks follow a similar logical approach of first analyzing the development needs and the climate-related risks. Second, identifying options and assessing them against predefined criteria. And then based on this, selecting alternatives, taking action, and monitoring the impacts of these actions to understand whether we're achieving the desired development outcomes, whether new risks have emerged, and whether changes are needed. This session will be mainly focusing on the Asia and Pacific region. During the session, we're also interested to hear from you about frameworks that you might be using and how they're similar or different to what the presenters will be sharing. As we're in webinar mode today, a reminder to ask that you use the chat box for your sharing. And as we get started, I'd like to just go over a couple additional housekeeping issues. So first of all, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, who you work for, and where you're located. Second, I mentioned already that we're in webinar mode. So in addition to using the chat box for your comments, we will be using the Q&A function to take your questions. And I saw during the plenary that many of you were already using the Q&A box quite well. We will have 3 dedicated question and answer times throughout the program, so we'll be able to take your questions live for the presenters. And if we run out of time, we'll also ask the presenters to answer in the Q&A box. Finally, as a courtesy, we'd like to remind everyone that we are recording this session. So joining, you are consenting to being recorded, although nobody will be showing their video or their photo. We have a great lineup of presenters today. So as we get started, I'd also like to remind my presenter colleagues that I will be watching the time and giving you a 1-minute warning when you're running close to your time by turning on my camera and giving you a wave. So watch out for that. For our first presentation on the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020, I'm pleased to introduce Christian Walder. Christian is a water supply and sanitation specialist in the water sector group of ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Christian is trained as an environmental engineer, and his work focuses on inclusive and sustainable water supply and sanitation solutions. He provides technical expert advice to ADP operations departments and develops knowledge management programs with the aim of keeping water supply and sanitation high on ADB's development agenda. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining the symposium today. It is my great pleasure to talk about one of the points that Brooke has mentioned in terms of analyzing the development needs. And I will talk in the next couple of minutes. I will give a quick introduction about one of ADB's flagship publication in the water sector, which is the Asian Water Development Outlook. ADB's goal is to achieve water security and resilience in the Asian and the Pacific region. When flipping to the next slide, you see that the Asian Water Development Outlook assesses the national water security of all ADB developing member countries. The interesting fact actually is that the latest version has been published in December 2020, but this is already the 4th version of the Asian Water Development Outlook. The first version has been published in 2007, with subsequent versions in 2013, 2016, and the latest one in 2020. So this gives really a comprehensive picture also about the development in terms of the national water security of ADB developing member countries over the last decade. I'm doing this presentation together with my colleague Lachlan, and he will talk a little bit more about the details. But with this slide on the right, I would like to emphasize that the Asian Water Development Outlook is being calculated by using 5 key dimensions. Key dimension 1 is related to household water security, key dimension 2 on economic water security, key dimension 3 on urban water security, key dimension 4 on environmental water security, and finally key dimension 5 on water-related disaster security. All the key dimensions, they follow a comprehensive methodological approach. That means it's really evidence-based and provides a comprehensive assessment of the water security of several countries, of all countries that are part of the Asian Development Bank. When flipping to the next slide, you see an overview of the scoring. I think there is no need for me to go into the nitty-gritty details because everything which is shown here, you can download it at ADB website. But basically the water security of all developing member countries is being assessed. And we have 5 stages. You see the 5 stages here at this slide, with the lowest stage, which is the nascent stage, for example, where a low portion of the population of urban and rural households have access to basic water supply and sanitation services. And there is a specific definition of each of the stages you see here. The next one would be the engaged stage. So with a 2 scoring, then the capable, effective, and finally the model stage, which would be the highest stage in terms of the national water security of a particular country. Again, this should give you an overview that obviously, as I said, there is a comprehensive methodology behind, and also there is a definition of the different stages. And when flipping to the next slide, this shows you basically an overview of the results of the latest Asian Water Development Outlook. Again, referring back to Brooke's initial point on analyzing the development needs. And again, there is plenty of information there. Let me just highlight 3 points. Yeah. So the first point, there is still one country in the Asian development region, which is in the nascent stage, the lowest stage. You see it here, it's Afghanistan. That means this country is still facing significant challenges in terms of achieving or increasing water security. The second point I would like to highlight, there is also no country based on the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020, which is in the model stage. So even the developed economies in terms of New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and others, they still have not reached the highest classification according to the Asian Water Development Outlook. They are scoring 4, but they are not yet in the model stage of 5. The third point I would like to highlight is that you see still so many countries who are in the second one, in the engaged stage. I think this audience, we are all aware that we are facing significant challenges in the wash sector in our region. And really also the Asian Water Development Outlook provides this evidence-based background about the challenges that we are facing in the region based on data and really results from the particular countries. When flipping to the next slide, I mentioned already in the introduction that the Asian Water Development Outlook is a series of publications, the first one in 2017 and the second, the subsequent ones in 2013, 2016, and 2020. And here you see a small comparison about the different results of different Asian Water Development Outlook publications. And generally, again, without going into the details, there is a positive trend. There is a positive trend. That means several ADB members have improved from the nascent and engaged rating to the capable and effective rating. That's very important information, but nevertheless, there are still challenges ahead of us. And 2 examples which are included here are coming from PRC, so from China, and from India, who managed to increase the scoring from the nascent to the engaged stage. Nevertheless, and I also tried to highlight this in my previous slide when you saw the overview that still so many countries are in the second and engaged stage. There are challenges. The challenges, they remain. And specifically in the context of climate change, these challenges are significant. Many people still live in the nascent and engaged stage of water security, That means they're facing challenges in addressing their daily needs for water supply sanitation. They are vulnerable towards climate change impacts. With this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Lachlan, who will dive a little bit into the details of 3 of the key dimensions. He will particularly talk about key dimension 1, 3, and 5. Lachlan is an adjunct research fellow at the International Water Centre, Griffith University, and he will shortly join Aurecon in Brisbane, Australia as a senior consultant. Lachlan has extensive experiences in integrated water strategic planning and water security throughout Asia Pacific, and he has been extensively working with the Asian Development Bank on this publication on the Asian Development Outlook 2020. Lachlan is passionate about system thinking approaches to ensure that no one is left behind. Lachlan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Christian. As timing would be perfect, my dog, who's been quiet for the last 2 hours, has just suddenly started to bark. So I hope that doesn't disrupt anybody. Next slide, please. So as Christian said, I'll be talking about 3 of the key dimensions: KD1, rural household water security; KD3, urban water security; and KD5, resilience to water-related disaster risk. So firstly, KD1, and this one, I was actually the lead researcher on. And so KD1 looks to measure, of course, rural household water security using 4 indicators, those being access to water supply, access to sanitation, health impacts, and affordability. And one thing that's really important to note about KD1 is that while the users use a relatively small amount of water, it has enormous societal impacts. So KD1 rural households are definitely those in most vulnerable that we're looking at as part of ADO. And therefore, it's most closely linked with the water is for all principle of the SDGs. Next slide, please. So what the results that we found in KD1 were, so as you would expect, Afghanistan and PNG were the countries that had the least secure water supply for rural households. The Maldives was the one that was improving most rapidly, and so that was some really good news. But concerningly, there was some decline that we saw in some Pacific countries. But generally, the increase that we saw in the Pacific was less than other regions. As you can see from this chart here, you know, the three lines. So as you can see in the chart on the bottom left, in the Pacific, the 3 lines are quite stable. And that shows that there's a lack of improvement there. So what we recommended from KD1 was that it really needs a whole of system strengthening approach, not just focusing on a single element. And this is true for WASH and for most forms of water management. For example, we know that comprehensive WASH policies exist in a lot of countries throughout Asia, but it's the severely inadequate resources, both human and capital, that lead to the poor implementation of those policies. So in particular, this system strengthening should really look at better engagement with social groups, addressing the critical human resource shortages, and then locally appropriate solutions in the Pacific, where you've got ultra small catchments. Next slide, please. So the second KD that I'll talk about today is KD3, urban water security. And so again, this KD had 5 indicators, those being, it was quite similar to rural households, as you'd expect, both being forms of domestic water security. So access to water supply, access to sanitation, affordability, and then drainage and floods, and then environmental water security. So next slide, please. So in these results, there was 7 countries that showed as nascent particularly in the Pacific, sorry, 7 in the Pacific and 1 in Southeast Asia. And that there was 18 member countries in the engaged level. So what was really shown quite clearly here, that there needs to be investment to improve water security in urban areas, because as population grows, largely that population growth will be centered around urban areas, and so therefore it's an added risk that that you can potentially increase investment, increase those with more increase the numbers of people with access to water, but you actually decrease your proportions. So we found here that you really need to pay attention to countries in the nascent or engaged level, so the lowest level that there is. And we must look at sanitation and wastewater treatment in a circular economy. The last one that I wanted to discuss of these recommendations is that there was no clear definition of urban across the member states that we looked at. So things like peri-urban and slum environments can be the most vulnerable. It was often unclear whether they were included in our urban water security or water security, and this was different from country to country, and unclear and important that we don't forget. The next slide, please. So then the final one that I'll be looking at today is, excuse me, so KD5, talking about water-related disaster security. This one was quite a different key dimension to the other KDs, and instead of having those 4 or 5 indicators, there was 3 types of water-related disasters assessed across 3 indicators. So those 3 water-related disasters being drought, flooding, and storms. And the indicators being hazard exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. You can see there's quite a scientific looking equation there, which was used to calculate the risk of each of those water-related disasters. So next slide, please. So again, what we found here is that, as you would expect, the Pacific Island nations were at greatest risk, and there was rapidly decreasing risk, particularly in East Asia. We also found here that it was the hydrologic or flooding risk that affected the most people in Asia from 2010 to 2019. So this is flooding is a really important area. So the recommendations that came from the KD5 team were to enhance the international efforts to standardize data. So this is a really critical one, because often in our data management with water-related disasters, in some countries, some wealthier countries, you've got very good data, but then in a lot of poor countries, there isn't the focus on being able to afford that, on being able to afford to capture that really good data. We also need to promote women's leadership and gender responsive approaches, and promote new mechanisms for financial risk. And then there is a few existing international frameworks which can be used as a focus. Next slide, please. So just to quickly wrap up, the recommendations from the whole of ADO is that water should be a centerpiece of sustainable rural development, particularly agriculture and water sanitation-based services, and then also disaster resilience. We need to achieve urban water security by not only investing in water and sanitation, but also looking at disaster risk reduction and services in peri-urban and informal settlements. We need to provide healthy environments, because there are massive flow-on effects to all of the community there. And we need to look at resilience to our water systems to mitigate potential impacts from climate change. So just on that climate change note, one thing that we've really been able to look at here in ADO is that we've developed quite a holistic explanation of water security, which considers water security as a service and the provision of that service. And we really must look to moving our discussion around climate change to it being a risk in preventing that service. We're not only talking about megaliters here. We've got to start talking about all the elements of water security, how climate change may affect them. Thank you. I have done it.
Great. Thank you very much, Christian and Lachlan. We have a couple of questions for you. We have about 8 minutes now for questions. And there's been a lively discussion and a lot of people asking for more information. So for anybody that asked for more information about the Asian Water Development Outlook or asked about specific analyses for specific countries, I'll just direct you both to the Q&A box as well as the chat box where Christian has put the link to the report that you can download and have more of a look through there. Perhaps I will direct the first question to Lachlan, which is from Danny Barrington. Danny is asking about how these key dimensions that you mentioned are making use of JMP and GLASS data as inputs.
So JMP, so as I mentioned, both KD1 and KD3 had access to water and access to sanitation as indicators. And for both of those, the JMP data was the main data source for that. No, really strong data source. What I would say is that the way that this adds and builds upon it is it brings in things like affordability, like the health impacts, like the environmental urban water environments, the environmental health there. So it adds and builds on it and really makes it clear that we're not just talking about access to water and sanitation and water security, but things things like affordability, health impact should also be included. You also mentioned GLASS. GLASS is an excellent resource, particularly for anything financially related. If no one's aware of it, I would really strongly suggest having a look at that. Unfortunately, though, it didn't have enough countries in the region. So just remembering, just offhand, I think it was about 30 of our 49 countries were covered. And so it wasn't enough to include in the data sets, but a number of the key dimensions discussed GLASS in a narrative sense. So it is definitely included in the narrative of the report. And as I'm sure Christian will agree with, please have a look at the report. It's a really great resource.
Thanks, Lachlan. Christian, I think you have something to add to that.
Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, maybe just to quickly add, Lachlan, you made excellent points, but just to add that there is also a methodology report coming out very soon. So this is basically a comprehensive description about the approach that has been taken in terms of calculating the different key dimensions. I think this is particularly important for colleagues who are more interested in the, call it nitty-gritty details of how we made up the calculation, because this was a very extensive and long, let's say, process in terms of developing and updating the different key dimensions. We were working with top-notch institutes, including IWC, over 2 years, basically, to develop and to calculate the latest results, which are included in the Asian Water Development Outlook. And there is a comprehensive methodology behind, and just to add that there will be a report out soon where you can find all the details. The second point I would like to mention, and then I give it back to you, Brooke, is really on data availability, specifically when we talk about safely managed sanitation, safely managed water supply. The Asian Water Development Outlook, really, we found the challenges that we are facing in terms of data availability. So we have to work to strengthen our data systems, our monitoring systems, because if there is no results, if there are no measures, if there are no data there, what will be the, let's say, what will be the implications for our policy recommendations? So this evidence-based assessment is super important, and this requires data. And we saw in many of our developing member countries, that data is not available, or only very limited data is available. And so we also have to work on strengthening our data systems.
Great, thank you very much, Christian. And I think that picks up perfectly on and echoes some of the points that were made during this morning's panel for the first session. of the day too about the need for more robust data and the evidence base. So maybe I can turn to a couple of questions in our last few minutes here that are broadly, I would say, about progress. So there was a question from Sylvia about what motivates countries to move up the ladder, or what are the enabling factors. There was also a comment about achieving the SDGs. And so maybe to tie some of these together, it would be great to have from either of you some of your broad reflections now that you are on the fourth Asian Water Development Outlook report, and now that you have this very good trend data, to understand maybe what are some of the outliers in terms of positive trends, or are there certain dimensions that have been slower to progress? And why do you think that is? So Lachlan highlighted a number of the recommendations related to each of the three key dimensions that he presented. And if you have any thoughts about progress, about enabling factors, and how that links to achieving the SDGs, perhaps whether the countries that have made the most progress on water security are also those that are making better progress towards achieving the SDGs, or not. Lachlan, you would look like you have some thoughts right off the top of your head about that. Over to you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, that KD1 water security, that was the one that I was the research lead on. So it's where I know most about it. So the country that improved the most during the Edo period was India. And the main reason for that was because of their improvement in rural sanitation. And so the Swachh Bharat program that they have had running there, really quite an incredible program. So I think the motivations that have been built into that program are really interesting, and I won't go into it too much now, but would strongly suggest people look into how the government there motivated the community, motivated all levels of government to work together in a collaborative way. So that would be sort of my main point there. Is it needs to be collaborative, with all types of government, and there needs to be some really strong motivating factor. And so those were both very much present in Swachh Bharat. And so please have a look at that. Excellent program.
Great, thank you, Lachlan. Christian, do you have a final thought?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And Lachlan, I fully agree. What we saw is the political leadership. Yeah, the political will, the political leadership is instrumental in increasing water security in many of our developing member countries. In terms of some of the countries where we saw even a decline sometimes, obviously we know that urbanization is such a huge trend, and we also saw that many countries, sometimes they cannot pick up with the speed of urbanization that is happening in many of their cities. And this is putting immense pressure on the local governments and on the country's governments to address those mega trends in terms of climate change, urbanization, and others, what we see in our region. I'd like to emphasize one point. Yeah. So the latest version of the Asian Water Development Outlook also has dedicated chapters on governance and finance. We have closely worked together with the OECD because we all know that water requires an integrated approach. We need this political leadership, as we have discussed now. And this is also why we have dedicated chapters on governance and finance, and also discussing the OECD government's framework, the governance assessment tool, and particularly also bringing up recommendations in terms of water financing. ADB as the major water financer in the region, this provides some very useful insights in those two important topics on water governance and water finance. And as I said, I would like to invite everyone to download the Asian Water Development Outlook, to have a look. And in case you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line. We are very happy to discuss any details. And there are also interesting case studies involved in the latest version. And I think this can really, let's say, provide some interesting things, interesting guidance for our political leaders in terms of improving the national water security in the respective regions and countries. Thank you. Brooke, back to you.
Great, thank you, Christian. I think we are out of time, unfortunately, for this segment of the program, but I really want to thank Christian and Lachlan for this presentation. And you guys have a couple of additional questions in the chat box. So just ask you if you could take a look at those as we move into the next presentation.
Sure.
I'm so thrilled that we now have over 200 people on the line for this session. So we want to hear from all of you. If you haven't introduced yourself yet, please go ahead and do that in the chat and use that Q&A function to keep interacting and asking questions. So now we're going to turn to our second presentation, which is from the WASH sector and really picks up on the key dimensions on rural and urban water, as well as the climatological risk from the Asian Water Development Outlook that Christian and Lachlan just shared. So we're continuing in that direction with those key dimensions. And this presentation focuses on the GWP and UNICEF framework for climate resilient WASH. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sylvia Gaia, who will present. And then she will also facilitate some sharing from colleagues about some applications related to this framework. Sylvia Gaia is the Regional Advisor for WASH, Climate and Sustainable Environment at UNICEF's East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, based here with me in Bangkok. And immediately prior to joining UNICEF's regional office, Sylvia led UNICEF's water and climate resilience agendas at UNICEF headquarters based in New York. And before that, she brings decades of experience in humanitarian and development work, as well as in the private sector. So Sylvia, thank you for joining, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this part of the session where I will explain the strategic framework on WASH climate resilience that the WASH sector is widely using across several countries. So in the next slide, I would like to start by referring a little bit of what is the impact of climate change in WASH, but also in children, right? So let me start by saying something that you may already know, which is that climate change is having an impact on the access, on the cost, on the quality, and the sustainability of WASH services for households, schools, and healthcare facilities. And climate change can directly impact the quantity and the quality of the water resources that people need, as well as the demand for water. And as you know, the water-related climate risks are very much related with having too much water, too little water, or polluted water, right? And climate change also affects the access to and the functionality of sanitation facilities and services, and the practice of the key hygiene behaviors. So basically, climate change affects children both directly and indirectly in many different ways, from the more obvious ones as the dehydration and malnutrition, of course, right through to a reduction in sanitation and hygiene practices and reductions in access to safe water, which of course we know leads to an increase of vector-borne and infection disease. Next slide, please. So the framework that was put in place some years ago gives the rationale for a structured approach to climate resilience in WASH. It proposes four main components. You see them here in this donut in the picture, right? The first one is understanding the problem. The second is identify and appraise options. The third one is delivering solutions. And the fourth is monitoring. The framework and the technical briefs that goes into the framework that you see here in the slides, which are the technical briefs that we have for each of the steps in the framework, all of them are available. But I'm going to explain a little bit in detail each of them. Not a lot of detail because we are not having a lot of time, but just to give a sense of what is in there. And we are also currently working in updating this, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the last slide. Now, on the next slide, we will see the first of the quadrants or of the steps, which is understanding the problem. So here, the normal thing is that you, in your respective countries, will convene the WASH sector and the key stakeholders, actors that you already know, but some other actors that you may want to identify, to undertake or validate at national or subnational levels the WASH risk assessment. The analysis should build on existing evidence, on observed climate impacts that you are realizing, and existing climate projections at the time scale and geographical scope that is available. And we understand that all of this is not always everything available or everything that we need, but is what we have available while we deal with. You may already know that risk results from the interaction between hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and this has been also presented by our colleagues from ADB. capacity also influences risk, right? And because capacity reduces risk. This risk analysis methodology consists of different sub-assessments, each with a scoring mechanism that allows to aggregate results and identify higher risks to WASH, in a way kind of organizing them and prioritizing them. Conducting this type of risk assessment also helps us to build the climate rationale of the WASH interventions. This means that we will be able to explain the rationale of the WASH interventions through the lens of climate resilience, because we are going to be clear about what are the climate hazards that we are addressing, about the information that is available to assess the exposure of vulnerable population and the WASH assets, and also the key vulnerabilities that we have identified and we are trying to assess. Now, moving on to the next slide, as part of identifying options, which is the second quadrant of the framework, right? You will work to identify and assess a list of potential options that can help address the impact of climate change on WASH services and to reduce the greenhouse gases emissions. Now, following this risk analysis that you have previously done, where the WASH sector was convened, the aim at this stage is to identify with the different stakeholders all together the options that you have to address these risks that were prioritized, that were chosen like the most important ones. Ultimately, having in mind the threefold objective of ensuring that the WASH infrastructure, services, and behaviors are sustainable, safe, and resilient to climate-related risks. Also ensuring that resilient WASH programs contribute to build community resilience to adapt to the impact of climate change, and also working towards a low-carbon WASH sector. In the next slides, and as a part of the identify and appraise options and to facilitate the process of narrowing down from a long list of options that can potentially address these risks that were identified, in this step you can use as a starting point a simple scorecard or a checklist for appraising and prioritize the options. You will need to build in this consultative approach that you started with the risk analysis. And the approach presented in this step is best carried through this consultation in the whole of the sector, for example, in a way of a workshop with the key stakeholders. The approach includes a number of criteria, as you can see here in the slide: effectiveness, efficiency, timing for implementation, which can be used to ensure the most appropriate options that you will be selecting and implementing. Using this criteria, you will be able to identify the best solutions to address the risks that you have identified, but in a very systematic way and very specific to your context. Now, in the next slide, which is on delivering solutions. Obviously, once you have identified the best options, the sector will logically implement at a scale the climate resilient WASH services, right, that have been identified as the best solutions. However, it's important here to reflect on the capacity levels that you have, considering that climate resilient WASH will require additional set of skills and approaches. Also, considering that it needs to be grounded in existing institutional roles and responsibilities. And very importantly, the capacity needs to be built at all levels, at national level, subnational level, local level, particularly with local authorities and key actors at local level. Now, the next slide, which is the fourth quadrant, is about monitoring. This step involves designing a set of climate resilient indicators that are linked to the shortlisted options for the interventions that you have identified in previous steps. The technical brief, Monitoring and Evaluation for Climate Resilient WASH, provides guidance on how indicators can be developed and used to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of measures that are introduced to enhance climate and community resilience and their contribution to the overall sustainability of the WASH services. This brief focuses on the additionality that climate resilience monitoring and evaluation introduces when they are incorporated into the existing monitoring and evaluation system. So it's not to invent a new thing, but really to add on. It provides examples of typical monitoring indicators that can be used and adapted where necessary. Now, moving to the final slide, I wanted to really mention that the framework is being updated and new technical briefs are under development. So you know that you have a lot of technical briefs already available in different languages. And this framework and the technical briefs support the implementation of this work that was developed some years back during 2014, 2017. The framework is now currently implemented in more than almost 90 countries, more than 85 countries, between 85 and 90. And we know that positively some other organizations are really adopting the framework as a reference resource to guide the development of WASH climate financing proposals. So this is really a sector tool that has been really spread out and really used in a lot of countries in the last few years. Now, we want, of course, to do an update, and this update includes updating the framework document itself and developing 2 complementary guides on how to use the framework in institutions, in schools and healthcare facilities, which was something that was really on demand. We also are adding new technical briefs, one on climate modeling for WASH, another on climate resilient sanitation, another on climate financing, another on community resilience. And also the technical brief on monitoring will be updated. And consequently, the capacity building materials that are available in the websites of UNICEF and GWP will be also updated. So this is a little bit what I had to share with you in terms of what is a sector tool that is being developed and implemented during the last few years in a lot of countries. But now we will really like to see how this is kind of put in action, right? And how the countries are really using this as a tool and combining with other tools that they have available. So we have now the privilege of have 2 countries with us to showcase their experiences during this panel discussion that will take some more minutes. We have Indonesia, who will focus on climate change and urban sanitation, and we have Timor-Leste that will explain a little bit on the WASH bottleneck analysis tool that was applied using a climate resilient model. So we'd like to start with, if she's available, because I know that she was traveling, Ms. Tri Dewi Birjin Yanti. She's the Director of Housing and Settlements and the Ministry of National Development Planning, known as Bappenas in the Republic of Indonesia. And you may have heard her in the opening plenary panel today. She was talking about the impacts of climate in WASH. I am not sure if she is available because I know that she was having challenges to get connected. But if Ubu Birje, if you are connected, I would like you to explain a little bit on the study that you did on climate resilient urban sanitation in 4 cities, where you looked at hazards, impacts, and responses. This is a clear example of how putting an analytical framework has been put into action. And I would like to ask if you could please share with us some insights of this study in the next 5 or 6 minutes. And I am not sure if you are available, but if not, I know that our colleague Ita from UNICEF in Indonesia is also available to answer.
Thank you very much, and I hope that I will respond in the right way, because in Frank that I didn't follow the introduction. I'm so sorry about this. So for the WASH climate resilience, especially for us in developing the framework, of course we are now with the help of the UNICEF and other partners as well, including maybe USAID, DFAT, UNICEF, and so on. We are developing what we call the frameworks to manage framework for WASH climate resilience. As I also mentioned in the morning session, that Indonesia is very familiar with extreme condition of climate events like heavy rains, hurricanes, floods, sea level rise, droughts, and other weather-related earthquakes or disasters that still continue to hit several areas. So public services, including wash services, are already impacting by this intensity. So, like causing the damage of several drinking water and domestic wastewater services, infrastructure, but also impacting the household in accessing the drinking water and latrine facilities. So that's why we trying to develop what we call the WASH climate resilient framework. That the objective is, I think it's very clear that to make sure that everybody have access to WASH, and this access is available, sustainable, and even has flexibility or resilience in regarding the high climate uncertainty. So, of course, we also want to develop the framework in a more also with lower greenhouse gas emission. We have this framework, of course. Previously, we already have what we call the National Action Plan for Climate Change. So we already have the National Action Plan on Climate Change Adaptation. It was updated in 2009, but of course this is still on the macro framework, more focusing on water security in terms of water scarcity and the potential of water reduction availability. So, but it hasn't really touching the more deep resilience in terms of water and sanitation, like infrastructure, how this infrastructure can be more resilient, how the access can be more sustainable in terms of climate change impacts. So, with the initiative that we start in developing the framework for WASH resilience with the help of several partners, we want to make sure that the WASH system will consist at least in this framework. I mean, how the beneficiary will be utilizing the services, and then how in terms of service providers, and then in terms of infrastructure, as well as in terms of funding. Next, Bu Ita, thank you. So of course, we will follow what has been already in the global environment as well. I mean, what is already the guidance, the framework that is already available at the global level. We will refer that, but of course, we still need to adapt that framework to the Indonesian context. We are still finalizing this process with the inputs from various stakeholders. There are two interesting parts of this adapted framework. First is the climate risk assessment, and the second is evaluation of resilient capacity. Of course, we cannot formulate what we're gonna do before we are assessing what we are at the moment. I mean, the baseline that we have at the moment, like identifying the climate hazard, identifying the exposure, how big is it? So we are assessing the climate risk. How big is the climate risk that we are gonna face in the future, medium and long term? And then, of course, we need to also to know what the state of the people at the moment, or the system, whether it's vulnerable or whether it's not that vulnerable. What is the level of vulnerability in our state at the moment? So from this, of course, then we can for the evaluation of WASH climate resilient, we will know then the capacity, whether it was climate resilient capacity, how is our capacity to handle or recover from climate shock and stresses. And then we also do the evaluation of WASH climate resilient capacity, comparing the current WASH system with the features of the climate resilience system. So what we have and what we want to have in the long term. From this result of assessment and evaluation, then we can then to identify and appraise some option of building the WASH resilience system. So we are at the process of finalizing it. So hopefully we will have some selection of climate change option under the identity and appraise. I mean, what we have the result from identity and price option, and then of course we need also to make sure that we can monitor the action that we're gonna do and monitor also the result. So the basis for us to moving forward in the future. So that's maybe what we have at the moment in Indonesia. But unfortunately, I have to leave. So Guita will take it from here for you if there is a question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Birji. Thanks a lot for making it, even if it was the last 5 minutes before you take the plane. It was very important for us to hear from you directly, and I know that we have Ita for if there are follow-up questions, but thanks a lot for presenting this because it's a very interesting angle coming from Indonesia. We will have some questions and answers at the end. So let's move now with the second presentation, which is from Timor-Leste. We have Suranga de Silva. He's a WASH specialist with UNICEF Timor-Leste based in Dili, where he leads UNICEF work on WASH as well as climate and environment. So Suranga, UNICEF worked with the government to carry out a WASH bottleneck analysis in 2020, which included climate resilient criteria in line with the framework that I just presented. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you incorporated climate resilience into the WASH bottleneck analysis exercise and help us understand a little bit how was your experience? So Surang, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. So I will not be using many slides and try to be concise and up to the point. So in 2020, we undertook the first WASH bottleneck analysis in Timor-Leste, but of its kind. And we should also note that Timor-Leste is a water-stressed country, and also we don't have a dedicated water supply and sanitation ministry, and the current lead institution is under a big ministry that serves both electricity as well as roads. So the profile for WASH is comparatively less. So we did the exercise under these circumstances. So in doing so, we classified the criteria for 6 main subsectors: urban water, urban sanitation, rural water, rural sanitation, and WASH in healthcare facilities, and also WASH in schools. Now, in the analysis, the tool has few building blocks. First, I will give some examples, such as policy and strategy, institutional arrangements, enabling environment, and capacity building, and so on. So these, out of number of building blocks, the participants themselves actually selected them according to the country context. Then under each building block, we have number of functions such as accountability, financing, planning, monitoring, social norms, etc. Again, they selected on their own. Then again, each of these functions, we classified bottlenecks, and that's where the climate lens was applied. Now, there were so many other lenses such as accountability, sustainability, and so on, and climate was integration was one of them. And also each bottlenecks were actually ranked with traffic lights, and also the participants were asked to develop their own action points with budgets. Now, findings were very interesting. We found that Timor-Leste is doing well in terms of climate integration in WASH, in terms of social norms and institutional provisions. That means that social norms are very positive to absorb and acknowledge the climate change, and also there are provisions in the existing institutional framework. However, we have some intermediate situation with amber grade in policy, regulations, capacity development, and also capacity development options particularly. You know that in some subsectors like rural water and urban water, the policy and capacity development were high, whereas some subsectors such as WASH in healthcare facilities, there were some loopholes. And then when it came to the red areas, that is deprived of the content substance, service delivery arrangements, service provider capacity, planning, monitoring, and evaluation were actually virtually did not exist. And this includes some solutions such as using renewable energy in wash sector. Now, the participant could not actually broadly discuss because of lack of time as well as lack of knowledge, areas like such as financing, budgeting, and accountability. However, the findings were pretty interesting, and then that led some trigger in the wash sector to look more positively on climate integration. And you know that soon after the bottleneck analysis, the COVID stuck. However, so we lost the focus in terms of bottleneck analysis follow-up, but yet the good thing is that climate focus in the wash sector moved on during the past 2 years, 2020 and 2021, especially because the Green Climate Fund has a big interest in Timor-Leste, and under the Secretary of State of Environment, there were a number of partners, accredited partners implementing multi-year and multi-million-dollar funding, such as UNDP on climate proofing wash infrastructure, and UNICEF now is almost about to get climate integration or readiness in Timor-Leste in terms of wash, and World Bank and Australia and ADB stepping into building back better urban water sector after floods. So I'm just giving some examples that during the last 2 years, the climate profiles were very high. Now the challenges is, I'm coming to my last few points in the interest of time. So the challenges we saw during the last 2 years that, that amid those dedicated and classified climate projects such as, carbon emissions and those sort of topics, the sectoral integration of climate was actually a little bit lost. And we are trying our best to reflect that while we need to have the climate dedicated projects, we also need to have sectoral integration, and WASH is one of the key priorities of Timor-Leste's government. Now, so we have been successful in going forward. Now there are some pilot projects on community-based water catchment management in terms of UNICEF facilitation, and also FAO is also integrating water management under the agricultural project support. The most important thing is now we have a dedicated, still not a ministry, but dedicated WASH lead that looks into the enabling environment of climate, and they are willing to lead that aspect. So now the way forward is to that all these climate integration in WASH is now scattered between different infrastructure category or agriculture category. So now our challenge is to bring them under one umbrella coordination mechanism and put in line with the WASH-BAT findings. So opportunities for us is that the DCF funding is going to be more, including one big project under UNEP for early warning systems, and also the government lead agencies willing to integrate, capitalize on integrated water management in the country, which UNICEF will be part of. And also, especially after COVID, there's a big interest in water conserving, hand washing, and sanitation solutions, which is a plus point for us again in terms of building the resilience in the sanitation sector, which is comparatively lacking in terms of climate integration. Finally, the COVID resulted in bringing in additional funding for washing healthcare facilities, and we managed to leverage that funding to eliminate some climate risk in the washing healthcare. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Suranga, because I think that it was also important to convey the message that the tool can be applied in different contexts. You can apply it to all the sector overall, but you can just go for rural or just go for urban, as was the case in Indonesia, point in case. You can go only for looking at the water sector or only at the sanitation, or both of them if you want to look at the community or households. I think it was important to showcase that this was an option and a choice that the country could make, because the tool is designed in this way that you can really choose. And also important the connection of how this then has been used to trigger some decisions and even potentially having an effect of leveraging funding, because, you know, understanding the bottlenecks and where you need to really act to assure an increase sector efficiency. And in this case, assuring that the sector efficiency is also climate resilience, right? The solutions that we are providing are climate resilience, is really a good tool to really try to leverage other resources and other funding. So thanks a lot for showcasing this also together with the example from Timor-Leste. I think that we will have now some time for questions, and we will try to answer as much as possible. So Brooke, over to you for moderating this part of the session.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. So we have quite a number of questions and some active chatting here. So maybe I can start with a question that follows up to Saranga about, which is related to one of the points that you raised a little bit about cooperation with other agencies and working across WASH and water resources management. So there is a question from Aditi about, she says, I want to know if and how we can integrate WASH in watershed management plans or in IWRM approaches. Can we integrate and create better solutions? So I wonder if you would like to speak a little bit to that.
Of course. I mean, you know that what matters here is that water, there is a big mix-up here in any country, I think, in terms of consumption, that is drinking water, and water usage for other matters such as agriculture and industries. So now Timor-Leste is being still a new country. We don't have that much of industry or stress on water, but Timor-Leste is naturally a water stressed country due to the prolonged dry areas. So even without a big industrial water demand, it's a still candidate for integrated water management. And now, what Timor-Leste lack is actually the water retention capacity, because we get high intensity rainfall within a very short period of time that runs off to the ocean at no time. So the right solution in terms of water resource management is to build big dams and increase the infrastructure capacity of water storage, which is mammoth, its exercise. So instead, the country has identified for drinking purposes that you increase the capacity of your own catchment, that your own soil, so that it will retain water as much as possible until the country meets some high-level infrastructure, in place. So this is where water resource management is really relevant to drinking water and eliminate to mitigate the risk of drinking, the climate impact on drinking water. So just to answer you, it's very relevant. I know some time back UNICEF was thinking that water resource management was not our mandate or a little bit above our mandate, but we feel that it's high time that we connect with them.
Great, thank you, Saranga. I'm going to direct a next question to Ita. Ita is an urban WASH specialist with UNICEF Indonesia, who, as Sylvia said, is stepping in to answer some questions on behalf of Ibu Vergi. So Ita, there was an interesting comment and question from a colleague from Ethiopia in the chat box, which said, climate resilient WASH is getting momentum this time in my country, Ethiopia. But what makes a WASH service climate resilient is a bit blurred. Can you tell us how to characterize a WASH service as climate resilient? And then I may, please, Ita, let us know your thoughts on that. And then I may also ask Sylvia if she would like to come in on that question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. So maybe I can start with our opinion related with this climate resilience. Seems like people might think that climate resilience is something that totally different with what we are doing in the common WASH system, but what we are thinking when we are adopting the climate framework that we are the UNICEF framework, and then also doing some mainstreaming at the local level. So seems like what we are now believe that the climate resilient WASH system is something that it's not quite different what we have so far now with the principle of the sustainability, equity, so on and so forth. But then we have need to add some more a characteristic or or component particularly related with the how you need to assess the risk that is coming from the climate hazard to the disruptions, not only to the surfaces of the and also on the infrastructures, but also the behaviors related with the wash. And then also with that, the risk assessment will also need to be added by the assessment of the capacity, the resilient capacity, as Ibu Virgi has mentioned earlier, which this is something that can be a basis for us to define the priority actions on how to develop this WASH climate resilience. But then answering the question on what is really actually the WASH climate resilience system, I think this is very much the question that's asked by many people, including in our countries as well, when we develop this. And then as we said that the climate resilience system should not only have the capacity to adapt on existing risk, we also think that the WASH climate resilience system should also feature some of capacity to manage climate information and respond to disasters. With that, we have 5 features at least. So we can call it as the WASH climate resilience system. One is need to be participative or collaborative. We have mentioned this many times, starting from the morning sessions. And then the system should also be adaptable. The system also need to be safe and strong, meaning that it can be to avoid or minimize exposure to extreme climate hazard. Needs also to be persistent, meaning that the system has to be accompanied by strategies and operating procedures. And lastly, the system should also use this low carbon. I think this is a hope I can answer the question. Brooke, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ita. And Sylvia, would you like to come in on that question also?
Yeah, maybe to complement what Ita already said, is that in UNICEF, we have been really scratching our heads a little bit around this definition of climate resilient WASH service, because we have been trying to look all over the place and we didn't find a definition indeed. So what we have adopted as a definition, we have taken into 2 approaches. One is the approach of process robustness, which is understanding that if you design a WASH service that is risk informed, so you have done the risk analysis, and that is designed in a way that has considered the risks and therefore is designed in a way that is able to withstand the different climate shocks, right? This is 2 important conditions. There is a third condition, which is a little related to what Ita was saying in terms of assuring that the service continuity will have the minimal disruption during an event, right? It's not possible to design a service that is 100% guaranteed that will have no shortage at all. But at least if there is a service delivery associated to the service operator associated to the service, at least we can guarantee that there will be a minimum disruption, right? And the 4th condition would be that at the most possible way, the services help to reduce the carbon footprint of the sector. So wherever is possible to apply renewable energies for the services, this will be used. So this is to measure climate resilience from a point of view of, have I taken all the measures to possibly design and choose the best options? If all of these answers are yes, the ones that I mentioned, then you can count this as a climate resilient. But then we have also an analysis that is post facto, right? Which is, for instance, in the case of the cyclone Idai in Mozambique, where the cyclone, everything was really destroyed by the cyclone. But indeed, the water system that were put in place before the cyclone were standing and were providing solutions and were providing water in a continued way to the population. So you have also a way to measure this in a post-factor way to assure that whatever you design, actually, if an event happened, actually it was the case that was able to meet the criteria. So I think that this would help a little bit to understand what is the definition that we are using in all the countries where we are trying to support with the framework implementation. Which also links me with another question, Brooke, that was about who is using this framework, who is doing, is this an organizational thing or is a sector? It's a sector framework and is used by the sector and for the sector. So the fact that UNICEF and GWP were the ones that developed it, it was just to have some people thinking about and getting this through the levels of different layers of authorizations and approvals. But now that is being implemented in more than 85 countries, this is a sector tool, and this is being implemented for the sector, for the sectors in each country to understand what do they need to prioritize and what do they need to do. And with examples of Indonesia and Timor-Leste, we have seen the different angles that each country takes in order to apply this framework in a different way so that they fit their particular context-specific reality and priority.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That's great. You already ticked another question off of our long list here. I see there's quite a number more in the Q&A box. So I'll also ask Saranga and Ita after this, after we close this, to take a look through the Q&A box and see if you can provide an answer to some of these. I wanted to ask another question to Sylvia. So this is a question that's just come in about areas where there is water insecurity and conflict. Conflict as a result to water allocation. And maybe can you say something not only about, I think this question is about allocations, but maybe about more broadly the link between water security, conflict, and peace, as well as, you know, kind of the link between humanitarian and development, which is something that we haven't touched on much yet in this session. Sylvia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, and I really welcome this question because indeed I was very interested in hearing the presentation of ADB on water security. And of course, as you know, as a UN water, there is, you know, this definition of water security. UNICEF is also using it in the way that we think about water security, and there are 4 dimensions that we think that are essential, right? One element of water security is access, and I think that Christian also mentioned, and Christian and Lakshman mentioned about, you know, there is no possibility of having water security if there is no access. So this is one important element for water security. The second one is to have climate resilience, because if the water services are not able to deal with the changes in climate, they won't be sustainable, and therefore the water security won't be assured, right? The third one is about water scarcity. And I could talk a lot about this, but let me just not start this passionate issue of water scarcity. But of course, in areas where the water is more scarce, water security, it's really a challenge. And therefore, it's a very important pillar, and we have to provide programmatic options to respond to this water scarcity. And the fourth, as Brooke mentioned, is the pillar on water and sanitation as a building social cohesion, and you know, by providing sectors across the whole of the population, the whole of the different ethnic groups, different layers, different types, if it's refugees, if it's IDPs, if it's host communities, by providing wash services that are reliable and available to everyone at the time that they are needed, this helps to build social cohesion, and this has an impact on peace dividends. And we have very wonderful examples, for instance, coming from Lebanon, and we have documented this. So if there is people interested, we can link them to these pieces of work.
Great, thank you very much, Sylvia. And maybe I'll just ask any of the panelists if you would like to respond to this question that we have, which I know is close to everybody's hearts, which is, how does the framework incorporate gender equality and social inclusion concepts to ensure access and participation for all? So I don't know if anybody has a thought off the top of their head about that, and some ways that we've made sure that gender equality and social inclusion are really at the heart of all of this work. Sylvia, you look like you like to jump in, or Saranga. Saranga,
Yeah,
over to
happy
you.
to. Oh,
Yeah.
Suranga, go ahead.
Yeah, so I can add something on this. As I said, Timor-Leste is a water stress country, and it still depends on a lot of conservative, traditional rural setup where the females and adolescent girls are actually mandated for fetching water. So during the dry seasons where you feel the water stress more, they had to really walk like a number of kilometers to fetch water. And by improving the water resilience in terms of, the example I gave, like catchment management, that you reduce the dry period so that your springs will have more water, so that your shortage time will be less. So that in that way you actually bring the gender perspective. And also one of the biggest challenge we have in Timor-Leste to sustain ODF is the lack of water. Timor-Leste is very positive in embracing CLTS and becoming ODF, yet sustainability has been challenged by because people demand improved latrines with four-flush system, but they cannot afford without water. So that compromise their overall sanitation and hygiene, including menstrual hygiene. So that's where the integration of climate actually, by and large, contribute to the gender lens. Oh.
Yeah.
Thanks, Saranga.
Bro, can I add something on that too?
Yes, please go ahead, Ita.
Yeah, thank you. Our effort in adapting the UNICEF GWP framework also based on our earlier study on the impact of urban sanitations in the four main climate hazard. And one of them is related with four main hazard: the flooding, the sea water rise, what you call it, the drought, and also the wind, the heavy wind. And then from those all the climate hazard, we found that the impact is severely more severe coming to the women and also children. Not also mentioning, and also mentioning about the family with the disability member. So this is something that not only related with the sanitations, but also the hygiene, including the menstrual hygiene management, which is really difficult when it's happened, when the climate hazard it happen. So this is something that makes the children's and then women in the more stressed conditions, because they cannot cope their demand for defecating, or also for their demand on hygiene. So that is with that basis on our studies, then we adopt the framework, which also include this social inclusion and gender equality in the framework. Then that's all. Bro, over to you.
Thanks, Ita. And maybe a final word from Sylvia, and then we will move on to the next part of the program. Sylvia, over to you.
I will answer a little bit in detail in the questions in the chat as much as I can. But on this one, on the gender and social vulnerability and social inclusion, all the parts of the framework have this analysis. Anita has mentioned about that during the risks, during appraising options. You look at the particular part of the vulnerabilities and how the most vulnerable groups are affected by the climate change. What are the solutions that are most effective? Because this is one of the criteria when you are choosing the solution. So definitely it's part of it. But thanks for reminding this, because it's definitely something that we want always to reinforce as much as we can. And definitely in the next update, probably will come a little bit stronger. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. A huge thanks to Sylvia and Saranga and Ita, as well as Ibu Vergi, although I know she had to drop off. This has been a really rich conversation. Please do continue to answer some of the questions in the chat. And I see Christian and Lachlan are also answering some of the questions that are posed to ADB and left over from the last session. So thanks guys for that. So now we're going to move into our next two presentations, which are the final two in this session, which are from ADB and then from Deltares. So first we will hear from Charles Rogers at ADB on ADB's Climate Risk Management Framework. Charles is a senior advisor for climate change adaptation at ADB, based in Manila, and has been there since 2015. He has served as senior environmental specialist within the ADB Regional and Sustainable Development Department, where he coordinated ADB's climate change adaptation program. His training and professional experience combined civil engineering and economics as applied to agriculture and food security, water resources development, and climate change. Charles, welcome. And I see your slides are already up, so we'll bring you to the spotlight. Great, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Brooke. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Great, yeah. Listen, it's really a privilege to be here, and it's amazing to me to see so many participants, and looking at the questions come by. You're very engaged participants and very well informed, so that's great to see. I'm going to talk about something maybe a little bit different than the presentations you've heard or will hear, because it's more of an operational framework that we've been using at Asian Development Bank since about 2014. And it doesn't focus exclusively on WASH, although it certainly gets heavy use with respect to WASH projects. And it was designed originally, as you will see from the progression here, around a project orientation. That's what ADB does. But increasingly, we are expanding this, and I'll try and give you the updates as we go along so you can see what the direction is that we're headed in. But we can look at the next slide. Great, thanks. First off, a very basic question: why does ADB have a climate risk management framework? Well, the simplest answer is that we provide financing to primarily to sovereign nations for long-lived public infrastructure that supports development, which means almost by definition that a lot of this infrastructure is going to be exposed to long-term climate risks. And these investments actually only make sense if the infrastructure, or whatever the investment may be, actually delivers the development benefits that it's designed to do. And of course, climate change presents at least a potential risk to that process. And when we develop projects, they're always co-developed with our developing member country counterparties. And it's been a matter of principle for many years now that these discussions that underlie decisions about lending and project design need to be conducted based on scientifically rigorous understanding of climate-related risks. So we, as a lender, and the borrowers are operating based on common information. And of course, the final point is that climate risk management and climate risk assessment are needed to ensure that any risks that we identify to a particular project or to a particular sector or area of economic or social activity are reduced to acceptable levels consistent with current scientific understanding, engineering technology standards, and environmental, economic concerns, among others. Let me note here that the description is of the current framework. We are moving in the direction of seeking to build resilience and enable transformational change. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this one's actually rather important because all projects aren't the same. There are large projects, there are small projects, there are projects in many, many sectors: energy, water, transport, agriculture, so urban development, so many that we do. And we want to calibrate this risk management process to the type and scale of projects we're dealing with. And so there are a number of questions that we sort of distilled down to that help us in this process. One is the lifetime of the scheme. Short duration projects simply need less attention to certain kinds of climate risks than long-term projects. And I'll give you a couple examples. Risk of lock-in, that is, are there irreversible decisions? When we locate a major bridge or a hydropower dam, we can't move it later on the basis of new information. So certain things we have to anticipate right at the time of initial design. The third's an important one, particularly with respect to WASH. What is the level of precaution warranted? And we can sort of conceptualize this as what are the consequences of being wrong in our assumptions, and in particular, our assumptions about, say, future climate risks. Large dams are a perfect case in point, both from a reliability standpoint and also from a safety standpoint. We also concern ourselves, of course, with the potential economic impacts of climate change. Are they sufficient enough to actually change the economic rationale for the project? If so, we have to take extra care to examine them. And the size of the project. If we have really big projects, we obviously spend more attention on those because there's actually a portfolio risk there as well. So next slide, please. Can you click it 3 more times? 1, 2, 3, perfect, thank you. This is just to illustrate the point about lifetime. What you're looking at are the bracketing projections from the CMIP6 that just came out last year and this year, RCP or SSP 2.6 on the lower bound and SSP 8.5 above. And you can see that if we're looking at something like an irrigation rehabilitation project that has maybe a 20-year design lifetime, we don't really have to be too concerned about which RCP or SSP we choose because they're very close at that point. You know, we make much heavier use for projects like that of historical data. We don't assume that we're in a new climate. We're assuming that we're still in the climate that we've been in for several decades. But if we look then out to, say, another sort of a polar example, like a large dam that's designed to stand there for 70, possibly 100 years, we have a responsibility to look at precautionary scenarios. In this case, that would be something like an RCP 8.5. This gives you a flavor of how these factors work their way into the risk assessment. Okay, next. Okay, the framework has 20 steps, and I'm not going to belabor the 20, but I'll sort of break them into phases. We have a project concept phase, which, like the name implies, is where we sort of jointly determine with the borrowing nation what kind of project we want, where it should be, the scale of the project, a number of things like that. And here our concern is both with preliminary screening, so we have a pretty good idea what the risks look like going into project development preparation. And also this gives us an opportunity to essentially do our background research. What is already known about that region, about that type of project? Have we done work before? Have others done that kind of work? So there's an opportunity there to do a lot of background research. If we go on to the next, I want to make sure I can get through all of this. What does our screening protocol look like? Well, I don't know how well you can see this, but we're up here in project concept phase, and our screening is a 2-phase process. We use a sort of a quick and dirty checklist screening to sort of sort out projects that are at no evident risk from those that are at medium or high risk. And if they are at medium or high risk, we subject them to a more detailed screening. And I'll show you a little bit about how we've been doing it now. And for those projects where the detailed screening confirms high risk, then we commission the climate risk assessment. So if you flip to the next, this is a tool we're currently using. It's called AWARE. If you can see there are about 16 different categories of risk. Each one is, I'll see if I can get through. I've timed it out at 10 minutes, but we'll see what we can do here. Each one is rated low, medium, or high, and there's a composite risk. And this essentially determines how we approach risk management going forward. And there's a risk report generated at this stage and so forth. So if we look at the next one, this is in some ways the most important, because in preparing the risk, and we prepare a climate risk and adaptation assessment, we look at 2 things, and actually 3, but I'll focus on 2. The first is the project itself and the vulnerabilities that project or aspects or components of that project have to climate change. And then the second on the hazards associated with climate. And we can do this in parallel. Increasingly, we have been focusing on the vulnerability assessment because in a way it streamlines the hazard assessment. And if you go on to the next, this is an example. And although the flow, this is for a generic WASH project, And although the flow appears to be from left to right, so let's start on the right side of this slide. And the way we do this is basically we look at not only the project as a system embedded in a larger system, say a catchment or watershed or distribution system, but we also look at components, and we look at how each one may be subject, either vulnerable or subject to a number of risks. For example, damage to physical assets, reduced service lifetime, increased operation and maintenance costs, reduction in reliability, and so forth. The point of this exercise is to understand which dimensions of climate change we need to focus on. So there we move over to the left side of the screen and select and prioritize from all the various kinds of data that is increasingly available, and we focus on those that are most important. Okay, next slide, please. So then the final phase of this adaptation, of this preparation, is to conduct an adaptation assessment. Basically, what do we do about any risks and hazards that we've identified? We collect as many options as seem reasonable. We subject them to multi-criteria analysis, including economic analysis, and choose one that is best suited to the project and the project context. I have an example here I'll go through very quickly. My apologies, it's not a, if we go to the next slide, it's not a WASH example, but I think it allows you to see what we're talking about here. This is actually a wharf project, a smaller project in Papua New Guinea, where if option one is simply to refurbish an existing wharf, we look at, say, 3 different options: a floating wharf, a climate-proof single-deck wharf, and a multi-height wharf to accommodate different kinds of traffic, and large and small boats. And then if we go to the next one, next slide, yeah, we see what is a very straightforward multi-criteria analysis, where we look at, among other factors, cost, complexity, maintenance requirements, robustness to a range of uncertain future conditions, flexibility of use, and so forth, and use some kind of a scoring mechanism to choose from among those options. Okay, and then the final stage is implementation, and this can take a long time. And an important thing happens in implementation, and that is we pass over operational control of this project from ADB to the borrowing country. And so we attempt to assist them in implementing this by first establishing arrangements for implementation and identifying needs for technical support. What kind of expertise is going to be needed to make this all work out? And increasingly what we're doing is using very specific language in what we call our PAM, our Project Administration Manual, and in some cases even loan covenants, so that in some cases we're actually telling the borrower, we've made some recommendations around climate risk management. These aren't just good ideas. We really expect you to implement them, or at least as many of them as you can feasibly accomplish. And then, of course, long-term, we design a monitoring and evaluation framework. And we've heard a bit earlier about suitable indicators and so forth. So move on from there. And I'll just say a quick word about how the process is supported. We've attempted to create a package of resources to support each phase in this process. I'm just showing you one of many, many, many. There's one I'll point to here that you might go out and look at. It's the guidelines for climate proofing investment in the water sector with an emphasis on WASH. These are all available from ADB's website. And I'm going to leave it there. I have another slide that reflects the results of a review of this process that recently took place, but we can get into that if we have time in the questions and answers. So I guess we hold the questions and answers until following the second presentation. It's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker. This is Andrew Warren, who is with Delta Res, and he is an expert in climate change adaptation, integrated water resources management, and his work focuses on the development and application of decision-making under uncertainty methodologies including dynamic adaptation policy pathways, which I think we'll hear about, and then to incorporate future uncertainties into long-range strategic planning. And I'm very much looking forward to this presentation myself. So Andrew, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Charles, for that kind introduction. I trust everyone can hear me now. So I'm actually going to build a little bit on Charles's presentation, and interestingly, Deltares did a bit of work with the ADB maybe 12, 18 months ago around dynamic adaptive policy pathways and integrating DAP for short, DAP into sort of more an integrated flood risk management framework. So the way we see DAP is it's a generic framework. So it can be applied to flood risk management, it can be applied to integrated water resources management, it can be applied to WASH. And so that's essentially the framing for my presentation this morning. But it's very much around this idea of we've heard a lot this morning, or this evening rather, about how to integrate climate risks into our plans and make our planning more climate resilient and so on and so forth. And Charles in his presentation was referring to let's look at the long term. But what I'm going to talk about this morning is how do we do that? How can we respect the uncertainties, the inherent uncertainties that we're going to have to deal with in terms of climate change, but also potentially social changes and things like that, and integrate that uncertainty into our planning so that when we design our adaptive plans, we respect that uncertainty and we can flexibly adapt to the conditions as they emerge. We know that the seas are going to rise. We know that we're going to be dealing with more extreme weather. That could be extreme droughts, it could be heat waves, and we're already seeing these pressures come to bear. The extreme storms that have been occurring in recent times, you might have picked up from my accent that I come from Australia. You know, there's earlier this year there were floods in southeast Queensland that have never been seen before, off the scales, never been recorded. A few years ago there were the bushfires, the wildfires that burnt pretty much the entire eastern seaboard, never been seen before. So we're dealing with challenges, starting to deal with challenges, particularly when it comes to extreme weather, that is off the charts. We don't have a historical record that we can rely on in terms of developing our plans. And if I look at if we look at the slide that's on the screen at the moment, it may be a little small for you. My apologies for that. But the key takeaway is we know that we're going to be dealing with more extreme weather, and we know that we're going to be dealing with challenges such as sea level rise, but we don't know how much change we're going to have to deal with. So if I look at the left-hand graph on sea level rise, it predicts that we could have sea level rise by the end of this century of around about 1 meter, or it could be 2 meters. And then if you go further out, we could be looking at changes anywhere between 2 to 4 meters, 2 to 5 meters. So how do we build and plan our infrastructure in such a way that we can deal with whichever one of those levels comes to bear? Equally, if we look at the weather extreme graphs over on the right-hand side of the screen, now these are very, very small, but the key takeaway from this is there's a high degree of model disagreement around the level of change we're going to have to deal with. We have an idea that yes, it's going to be slightly worse, or maybe it'll be slightly drier, slightly wetter, these sorts of things, or there'll be more droughts in these parts of the world. But in terms of how bad that will be, or how much water there will actually be for growing crops or for water supply, yeah, we're a little bit more uncertain. So this is why we need to confront the uncertainties. And as Charles was saying, we're building infrastructure in many instances that is going to be in place for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 100 years. So we need to make sure that the infrastructure that we put in place is going to still be worthwhile for its entire design life. Next slide, please. So, the titles drop down on this one, but basically, how do we best plan for these sort of climate-related extremes? I mean, we've got different options that we know that we have available to us. If we look at, say, some coming from more a flood risk management background, do we protect the coast or do we nourish it? Do we use nature-based solutions? Do we accommodate the incoming waters, or do we advance into the sea? If I think from a WASH perspective, do we look for more nature-based solutions and try and inject water into the into the surface, increase infiltration? Or do we look at more extreme technical solutions such as desalination? All of these options are on the table, and how can we best make the right decision given that we have limited and constrained resources to do so? So the key questions around this piece are, if you could click once more, what to choose, where to do it, and when to do it. All right. Okay, next slide. So that's the reason we're trying to do this, and what we're trying to do is integrate these uncertainties into our adaptive plans. And the key is that we're not trying to eliminate the uncertainty. We're not trying to conduct assessments and investigations and research so that there is no more uncertainty. We have perfect view of what's going to occur, and then we plan accordingly. Because we know we can't do that. We're never going to be able to predict the future, because as I've already mentioned, we're now dealing with things that we don't have a historical record for. So the aim is not to ignore, is not to eliminate uncertainties, but the key is not to ignore them. Because if we ignore the uncertainties, we very much limit our abilities to take corrective action in the future. So for example, if we plan for one scenario, I can guarantee that scenario will be wrong. And therefore we end up in situations that could best have been better avoided. And the other thing about ignoring uncertainties is that we miss opportunities. There's a vulnerability side to this, but then there's a big opportunity side to this, because as risks increase, that opens the space for alternative, more transformative actions to be considered. But the key thing is that what we're trying to do when we're building up our plans is we're really trying to aim for what we call robust plans. So these are plans that will succeed regardless of the future that unfolds. But then also these are plans that can be adapted so that they are flexible, right? So that we can flexibly change our plan as the new situation comes to bear. So we want both flexibility and robustness in our plans when we're dealing with these so-called deep uncertainties. Next slide, please. And that brings me to DAP. So this is how we at Deltaris, which for those who are unaware, it's a knowledge institute in the Netherlands, have integrated uncertainty into an adaptive planning process. And you'll notice that it's presented as a stepwise framework. It's highly iterative. The steps can be moved around a little bit. It's not necessarily that it has to be followed completely slavishly, if you will. And you'll also recognize that it shares a lot of similarities with the frameworks that others have presented this morning, such as Sylvia and so forth. But the key difference with DAP to the other frameworks, yes, we describe the system. Yes, we look at options. Yes, we monitor them. We implement those options and we monitor the changes. But the key thing that we try and differentiate with DAP is we take into consideration the uncertainties and the limits to the actions that we have on the table by this integration of what we call adaptation tipping points and adaptation pathways. And when we're talking about adaptation tipping points, we're referring to the limits that a particular action may have in terms of its physical limits. So if I'm thinking of a water supply, if I install a new reservoir, there is a limit to how much water or how many people that reservoir can supply water to. And it will reach that limit at some point, provided it still keeps getting filled up by rain each year, right? Likewise, similarly, if I think of a more technical option, such as a desalination plant, it's designed for to deliver a specific amount of water. And once it's delivering that amount of water, we need to do something else, right? We need to either augment it or take up a new option. Thanks, Brooke. I see you're waving at me already. So if we go to the next slide, thanks. So the next point I'd like to make is really around this piece of adaptation pathways. In that, through the DAP process, we're analyzing all these different actions. We look at their tipping points, the limits to how much change they can accommodate. And then we look at the way we can sequence them together in time. So the key thing about DAP is we're trying to bring this time, the temporal element of decision-making, into the plan. So we start to sequence the different actions. We see once we run out of time with or reach our threshold, our adaptation tipping point with one action, we switch to the next action. So we already know what we're going to do as the change unfolds. And that's how we build flexibility in. We're considering a large amount of change, and we've already planned what we do as that change occurs. So first we do this. Once we reach that limit, we do this. Once we reach that limit, we do that. But we're keeping our options open for the future. We're not trying to build up a single pathway, but the idea is to have multiple pathways, and depending on how the future unfolds, you choose your pathway depending on how much change you're going to have to deal with. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time remaining, but if we just go to the next slide, and if you can click through, I think it's probably about 4 clicks. It'll fill the slide, maybe one more. Yeah, that's perfect. The key thing about when we're using DAP is when we're looking at issues of long infrastructure lifetimes, when the system is particularly sensitive to the uncertain changes. So if in one scenario there's going to be a little bit of change, but if in another scenario there's going to be a lot of change. When there's what we call high path dependency risks, so that's when one action really either limits the ability to do other options, or is required for those later options to occur. And then also when there's high investment costs. So basically when the potential for regret is high, and you'll see that there's some crossover to Charles's factors from his presentation as well. And my final slide is a summary slide, but I probably don't have time to go through that. But in sum, what we have with DAP is a flexible framework, decision support framework, to incorporate our deep uncertainties into our plans and help make them more flexible and robust. But I'll happily answer a few more questions around this and in the chat, and obviously we'll share the slides at the end of the presentation. But Brooke, I've spoken for too long.
No, this is fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. And maybe we can bring Charles back to the spotlight also. Charles, maybe we can start with you. And there's actually a question that so 2 questions for you. First is about how you would advise WASH to take the lifetime approach to climate risk into account. So where does WASH fit on this sort of timescale that you were mentioning? And then there's a second question, which I think is also relevant to one of Andrew's summary points. So maybe I'll ask first Charles to speak to it, and then Andrew, which is about how to have meaningful engagement of the right stakeholders and decision makers during these processes. So Charles, over to you.
So this is an interesting question because in a way, when we talk about the lifetime of a project, there's no one lifetime. There's a finance lifetime, which is the length of the loan. It's usually 30 years. There is a design lifetime, there's a service lifetime, which is usually longer, and then many projects will just continue delivering services for decades beyond their design lifetime. And then there's the issue that Andrew brought in, which is path dependency. In other words, once you've made an investment, you say, okay, this is 40 years and done. It's never that easy because other investments take place around it. And before you know it, you have a whole complex of investments that will certainly outlive the original one. I think the approach to get down to WASH, I think, I mean, what we will do for very large projects, say a project that really does involve, you know, source water development through reservoirs or what have you, is we'll look at all the components. We'll look at the project as a system, but then we'll look at the individual components. And for example, and again, this is sort of, I think, consistent with DAP, we can ask the question, well, okay, a water distribution system may last for 35 years before it starts leaking and needs to be replaced or upgraded. Maybe, you know, our projections tell us the population will expand. We really want to know, in some form at least, what our options are when, let's just say, a water distribution system in a medium-sized city is no longer capable of meeting demand. Do we take a modular approach and build another treatment plant and extend the distribution field? Do we diversify source? Do we take out, you know, do we focus on reducing non-revenue water? The point is you need to think about them. So yeah, my general sense is that WASH projects all have to be considered as having a longer service lifetime than their physical components would suggest. You're not going to abandon, let's just say, an urban water supply project in a medium-sized city because pipes in some neighborhoods are getting old. No, you're going to replace them as long as everything else is still working. And if you set out with that understanding, I think you can get dramatically longer service out of a system than the initial assumptions might be. Now, I don't know if that answers the question. We can go back into that. But.
Thanks, Charles. And maybe in the interest of time, I'm just realizing that we've had a really rich presentations and really rich number of questions coming in. Maybe I'll go to Andrew for this question about stakeholder engagement and involving stakeholders and decision makers in this process. And there was a related question for you about motivating particularly local governments to use DAP as a method, basically. So Andrew, over to you.
Well, yeah, thanks for the question, whoever posted it. Absolutely, stakeholder engagement is central to the approach. I mean, we're dealing with uncertainty. So one of the first things that we're dealing with both uncertainty and then we're dealing with multiple perspectives, because when we're talking about, typically we're talking about multi-stakeholder settings. So given that there is uncertainty and ambiguity and everyone will have a different opinion about how much change perhaps there might be, the stakeholder engagement part is central to the whole process. Like we need to be getting everyone to agree on what amount of change we're going to make our plan for. Like, what do we agree that, okay, this is how, this is what we're going to plan for. This is the level of uncertainty that we can identify at this point in time. This is what we feel comfortable. This is what we think we can actually get over the line, because there's also a political element to this as well. But in terms of integrating stakeholders into the process, we pretty much see it occurring at every step of the process, defining the context, identifying options, conducting the risk assessment with stakeholders so that they can appreciate what potential risks are out there, choosing the options, building up the pathways, the whole thing. Are there specific tools for doing that? Yes and no. I mean, it's not that it's revolutionary. Often it's just workshops with flip charts and post-it stickers and these sorts of things. It doesn't need to be any more complicated, but more to the point is within these sessions, it's trying to get across this idea of what we call pathways thinking. So it's really trying to get stakeholders to think in terms of the long term, and then trying to identify, options that are perhaps, a little bit more blue sky thinking of, or out of the box type of options, more transformative options that should very serious adaptation be required, significant adaptation be required that changes the way that the whole system works, then at least it's on the table and can be up for discussion.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I mean, I think this has been just fantastic presentations, a lot of food for thought. You have a lot of additional questions coming in the Q&A box here. So we're a bit short on time. I'm going to pass over to Christian to close us out here in the session. So perhaps I'll just thank Andrew and Charles and ask you to have a look at that Q&A box and see if there's anything that you can answer or point people to additional resources where they can find more about the work that you're doing online. So thanks so much. This concludes all of our presentations for today. And for some final reflections, I'm really happy to hand it back over to Christian Walder from ADB, who will close us out for the session. So Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke. I think we could go on for another hour, but it's time. Unfortunately, I have to bring this session to a close. So at this point, I really would like to thank UNICEF colleagues and all presenters and panelists for your valuable contribution, and Brooke also for your excellent facilitation. But specifically, I would like to thank all participants for your very active engagement and all your questions and comments in the Q&A and in the discussion. Having such an engaged and interested audience is just amazing for presenters and speakers. We have heard exciting insights on the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020, the GWP UNICEF Strategic Framework for Climate Resilience WASH. Ibu Verji from Indonesia and Suranga from Timor-Leste shared with us their experiences on climate change and urban sanitation and the WASH bottleneck analysis tool. And finally, we heard from Charles about ADB's approach to climate risk and from Andrew about the dynamic adaptive pathways planning approach. So I truly believe that this was a very rich session with lots of important and useful information for all of us. Please do not hesitate to reach out to panelists if you have any particular follow-up questions or comments. We are ready to work together with you and ready to reply to your comments and emails. Let's join hands and work together to manage climate change related risks in WASH more effectively and successfully, with the goal to make our Asia-Pacific region more water secure and resilient. At this point, I also would like to express my gratitude and thanks to Regina, Karin, and the organizing team, as well as the tech and IT team for your excellent work and support in organizing the symposium. For the audience, please stay online. Please do join and enjoy the subsequent sessions of this important event, of this important symposium. With this, I would like to close. Thanks again, and I wish you all a very good evening ahead. Thank you so much.